Right. So today we're going deep on sanctuary cities.
Okay.
And specifically, we're looking at this Justice Department lawsuit against Chicago and Illinois.
Yeah.
We got a whole bunch of sources here. News articles, legal analyses, even an FAQ on this whole complicated thing.
Sounds pretty dense.
Yeah, it
Okay.
is. And it's interesting because it gets to the heart of how we as a nation approach immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a big one.
It is.
And you know what's interesting is that it's not some abstract legal debate.
Right.
This is
real.
this is real world stuff. This is about tension between federal power and local control.
Right.
And it raises some serious questions about what it means to even be a sanctuary city.
Yeah, because sanctuary city, it's not even a real legal term, right?
Exactly. It's not an official legal term.
So what are we even talking about?
Yeah, so it's more of a catch-all phrase,
Okay.
And it really refers to a whole bunch of different policies and practices that cities adopt to limit how much they work with federal immigration enforcement.
Okay, so a spectrum of policies.
Yeah, think of it as a spectrum.
I like that.
Yeah.
So, what does that look like in practice? What falls under that umbrella?
Well, on one end, you've got cities that just limit the information they share with ICE.
ICE?
Yeah, Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Okay.
They might, for example, decline to honor ICE detainers.
Now, when you say detainers, what does that mean?
So basically, it's like ICE asks local law enforcement to hold someone in custody longer than they normally would,
Okay.
even if they're eligible for release, so that ICE can come and take them into custody for potential immigration violations.
Okay, so they're saying we're not going to hold people just because ICE says so.
Exactly, and that's just one example.
Wow.
Some cities go even further, and they actually make these practices into law,
Really?
like through local ordinances.
Interesting.
Chicago's a good example.
Okay.
They have an ordinance that says city agencies can't help ICE agents in any way. No access to detainees, no help with investigations, nothing.
They're drawing a hard line.
Yeah, they are.
So what's the thinking behind that?
Well, cities like Chicago, they say that these policies actually make things safer.
Okay.
The idea is that if undocumented immigrants aren't afraid of being deported just for talking to the police, they'll be more likely to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, and basically keep their community safe.
So it's about building trust.
Right, exactly.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But obviously, this approach has its critics.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where this lawsuit comes in.
Okay.
The Justice Department, they're going after Chicago and Illinois.
Right.
They're claiming that these so-called sanctuary laws are getting in the way of federal immigration enforcement.
All right.
They say that these policies are making it harder to find, arrest, and deport people who are in the country illegally.
So it's local priorities versus federal mandates.
Yeah, you could say that.
So the Justice Department is pointing to some very specific things in this lawsuit, right? What are
They're focusing on the Illinois Trust Act,
Okay.
which prevents local law enforcement from detaining people just based on those ICE detainers we talked about.
Right.
They're also targeting the Chicago ordinance that stops information sharing with ICE and limits ICE access to city facilities.
So basically, you're tying our hands.
Exactly. They're saying we can't do our jobs.
And it sounds like they're saying it's not just about inefficiency.
No, they're framing it as a national security threat.
Okay.
They're claiming that sanctuary cities are hiding dangerous criminals and putting communities at risk.
That's a serious accusation.
Yeah.
How are Chicago and Illinois responding to that?
Well, they're not backing down at all.
Okay.
Both Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson have come out strong
Yeah.
defending these policies, and they say they're going to fight this lawsuit all the way.
So we've got these two very different stories here.
Yeah.
What's the legal strategy behind the Justice Department's lawsuit?
Well, their case is built on the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which basically says that federal law trumps state and local laws.
Right.
The Justice Department is arguing that these sanctuary policies clash with federal immigration law, and so they're unconstitutional.
So it's a power struggle.
It is.
The feds are flexing their muscles.
Yeah, they're asserting their authority.
But I'm sure Illinois and Chicago have a counter-argument.
Oh, they definitely do.
What is it?
Their argument is based on the 10th Amendment,
Okay.
which says that any powers not specifically given to the federal government belong to the states.
Right.
So they're saying that managing local law enforcement and public safety, that's a state and local issue, not a federal one.
Okay.
They argue that federal law doesn't force them to actively take part in immigration enforcement.
Interesting.
And that they're just choosing to use their resources on things like fighting crime, which they see as more important for the safety of their residents.
So it comes down to interpretation.
Yeah. Whose reading of the Constitution is right?
Right.
Whose legal arguments are going to win?
Sounds like this is going to be a long, messy legal battle.
Oh, yeah. It has all the signs of one.
And this isn't even the first time the Trump administration has gone after sanctuary cities, right?
You're right.
Didn't they try to withhold funding from these cities back in Trump's first term?
Exactly.
Like using money to force them to comply?
Yeah. Using the power of the purse.
But a lot of those cities, including Chicago, they fought back in court.
I did.
And they actually won.
They did.
So there's this pattern.
Yeah.
The Trump administration pushes for stricter enforcement, targets sanctuary cities, and then faces legal challenges.
That's a good observation.
It speaks to this bigger trend.
Yeah.
This tug of war between federal authority and local autonomy.
Absolutely.
And it makes you wonder about the future of immigration policy in this country.
Yeah, it really does.
Who gets to decide how immigration is enforced at the local level?
Right. Is it Washington, D.C., or is it the cities and states?
These are like fundamental questions about power in our system.
Big question.
Yeah. And speaking of the balance of power, the sources also mentioned birthright citizenship.
Right.
Which feels relevant here.
Yeah.
The Trump administration tried to end it, didn't they?
They did.
Which was pretty controversial.
It was.
What happened there?
Well, they argued that kids born in the U.S. to undocumented parents shouldn't automatically become citizens.
Wow.
It was a really controversial move, and ultimately a federal judge in Washington state said it was unconstitutional.
Another legal loss for the Trump administration.
It was.
But let's get back to Chicago for a minute.
Okay.
These legal battles are interesting and all, but at the end of the day, this is about real people's lives.
You're absolutely right. We can't forget about that.
And the articles we have here, they paint a pretty disturbing picture of the fear and uncertainty in immigrant communities in Chicago.
Yeah, it's unsettling.
So what are the potential consequences of this lawsuit for those communities?
Well, if the Trump administration wins, it could be devastating. We could see a huge increase in arrests and deportations.
Right.
Families could be separated. Lives could be turned upside down.
Oh, yeah.
And it could also damage the trust that Chicago has built with these communities,
right,
which could make everyone less safe.
It's a stark reminder that these aren't just abstract debates.
No, they're not.
They have real-world consequences.
They do?
And often for the most vulnerable people.
Exactly.
And we can't forget that this isn't just about Chicago.
No, this is bigger than Chicago.
This lawsuit could set a precedent for other cities.
Right. It has implications for sanctuary cities all over the country.
So the stakes are really high.
They are.
This could be a landmark case with the potential to reshape immigration enforcement in America.
That's a great way to put it. This case could redefine the relationship between the federal government and local governments when it comes to immigration.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, there is.
But I think it's time for a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to keep going with our deep dive into sanctuary cities.
Sounds good. And it's not just legal stuff, it's about people.
Right. The human cost.
Exactly. We can't forget that this could really make people afraid to participate. Like, if people are scared to report crimes or even talk to officials because they might get deported, that just weakens the whole idea of a functioning society.
It really makes you think about the balance, between enforcing the law and keeping trust in communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And to really get this, we need to look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
Remember, this isn't just happening in Chicago and Illinois.
Right.
This is a national conversation, even a global one, about how we deal with immigration in a world that's so interconnected.
So how does this lawsuit against sanctuary cities fit into the bigger picture of immigration policy?
Well, it's a pretty clear sign that the current administration is all about stricter enforcement.
Okay.
And it's not just about undocumented immigration either. The Trump administration has been tough on legal immigration, too. Like making it harder to get visas, restricting asylum claims, even separating families at the border.
So it seems like a very intentional strategy.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's a multi-pronged effort to reduce immigration overall.
And there are people who support that approach, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a part of the population that really believes in limiting immigration, both legal and illegal.
And what are their reasons?
They say it's about protecting national security, saving jobs for American citizens, and preserving our culture.
So it's not just about Trump himself.
Right. It's about tapping into a sentiment that's already out there.
And of course, there's a lot of debate about the economic effects of immigration.
Yeah, for sure.
Some say immigrants take jobs from Americans and lower wages, while others say immigrants actually help the economy by starting businesses, filling jobs, and paying taxes.
Very complicated.
It is. What I find really interesting about this case, though, is the clash of visions. Like, on one hand, you have the Trump administration's vision, which is all about national sovereignty, border security, and a more unified national identity.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have cities like Chicago pushing for a more inclusive and welcoming America, one that values diversity and sees immigrants as assets.
It's a clash of values for sure.
Totally a disagreement about the kind of country we want to be.
Exactly. And this isn't just happening in courtrooms and legislatures. It's happening in communities all over the country.
Right.
In town halls, school board meetings, around dinner tables, on social media.
It's a conversation we should all be having.
Absolutely, no matter what our politics are.
Because it's about real people.
That's right. At the end of the day, this isn't just about ideas and legal arguments.
It's about real lives.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to hear from the people who are actually affected by these policies. The undocumented immigrants living in fear of deportation.
Right.
The families being torn apart.
The communities trying to balance being welcoming with following the law.
Their stories matter.
They do. Their perspectives need to be heard.
I agree. And I encourage you, as you learn more about this issue, to seek out those voices.
Yeah.
Read their stories, listen to their experiences.
Because that's how we can connect with each other.
Right. Through empathy and understanding, we can overcome our differences and find common ground.
That's a great point. Speaking of common ground,
yeah,
one thing that struck me while reading these sources is that the sanctuary city debate is more complicated than it seems.
Oh, absolutely. It's not as black and white as people make it out to be.
It's often presented as you're either for it or against it.
Yeah.
But it's way more nuanced than that.
It is. And even within the sanctuary city movement, there are different approaches.
Oh, really?
Some cities focus on limiting how much they work with ICE.
Okay.
While others go further, like offering municipal IDs or legal help to undocumented immigrants.
So even within that sanctuary city label, there's a whole range of commitment and approaches.
Exactly. And those differences can have a real impact on how undocumented immigrants live their lives. For example, a city that gives out municipal IDs isn't just making a statement.
Right.
It's giving undocumented residents a way to identify themselves. So they can access services, open bank accounts, even report crimes without being afraid of being sent to ICE.
So it's about more than just protection from deportation.
Yeah.
It's about empowering people to live with dignity.
Absolutely. And to contribute to their communities.
And there's another point that often gets missed in this whole debate.
What's that?
People often think the sanctuary city movement is just a liberal or progressive thing.
Right.
But it's not that simple.
No, it's not. There are actually conservative and faith-based groups that support sanctuary policies, too.
Interesting.
What motivates them? Often it's compassion religious beliefs or a belief in the dignity of all people.
So it's not just a left versus right issue?
No, it's not. There's a moral and ethical side to it that goes beyond politics.
I think it's important to recognize those different perspectives.
I agree.
It reminds us that this isn't about scoring political points or attacking people who disagree with us.
Right.
It's about dealing with a complex issue.
Yeah.
It has real consequences for real people.
And finding solutions that reflect our values as a nation.
Shared values. I like that.
You too?
It means we can find common ground, even if we disagree.
Exactly. But to find that common ground, we have to listen to each other.
Yeah.
Understand where each other is coming from.
You're right. It's about seeing the humanity in those who have different views, even if we don't agree with their conclusions.
And that's a really valuable lesson from all of this.
It is.
Whether you agree with sanctuary cities or not.
Right.
Whether you support the Trump administration's approach to immigration or not.
It's important to approach this with empathy.
Yeah.
And an open mind.
And a willingness to have respectful conversations.
Because we're all in this together, right?
We are. We all have a role in creating the kind of society we want.
I love that. And that's a perfect transition to our final thought for today.
Okay.
What's something our listeners can think about as they continue to learn about this issue?
Here's something to consider. We've talked a lot about the legal and political sides of this debate. But what about the moral side?
Right.
What do we owe to the people who are trying to build a better life in our country? What does it mean to be a welcoming and inclusive society?
That's a good question.
These are questions that go beyond laws in politics.
Yeah.
They're about who we are as a nation.
Right.
And they're questions that each of us has to wrestle with.
That's a powerful challenge. And I think it's a great way to end our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the legal details of the lawsuit to the bigger questions about the role of local communities in immigration policy.
It's been a good conversation.
It has. And hopefully we've given our listeners some things to think about, some new perspectives, and some motivation to keep learning about this important issue.
I hope so.
As always, we encourage our listeners to do their own research.
Yeah.
Find different viewpoints.
Yeah, absolutely.
And have respectful and informed conversations about this and other important issues facing our society.
That's the key.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about the moral dimension because I feel like that gets lost a lot in all the political back and forth.
Yeah, for sure.
And, we've been talking a lot about Chicago.
Right.
But it's important to remember that the sanctuary city movement, it's not like one big uniform thing.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
There's a lot of variety within the movement itself.
Okay.
Some cities, they're more pragmatic.
Okay.
They just want to limit cooperation with ICE,
Uh-huh.
make sure their local resources are being used well.
Makes sense.
But others, they're driven by this deeper sense of social justice.
They want to do more like offering municipal IDs or legal aid to undocumented immigrants.
So even with that label, sanctuary city, there are different levels of commitment, different approaches.
Exactly. And those differences can really affect how undocumented immigrants actually experience life in these cities.
So give me an example.
Well, take a city that provides municipal IDs.
Okay.
That's not just a symbolic thing.
Right.
It's giving undocumented residents a way to identify themselves.
Makes sense.
So they can get services, open bank accounts, report crimes without being afraid of being handed over to IC.
It's about creating an environment where everyone feels safe.
Exactly.
And can participate in the community.
Right. And that brings up another point that I think gets missed a lot.
What's that?
People often see the sanctuary city movement as this purely liberal or progressive cause.
Uh-huh.
But it's way more complex than that.
Really?
There are conservative and faith-based groups that support sanctuary policies too.
Interesting. What are their reasons?
Well, often it's compassion or their religious beliefs.
Right.
Or a belief in the inherent dignity of every person.
So it's not just a left versus right thing.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
There's a moral and ethical dimension that goes beyond those political labels.
I think recognizing those different perspectives is so important.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that this isn't about playing politics.
Right.
Or demonizing people who see things differently.
It's about wrestling with a really complex issue.
Yeah.
An issue that has real consequences for real people.
In trying to find solutions that reflect our values as a country.
Exactly.
I like that shared values.
Yeah, me too. It suggests that there is common ground.
Right. Even if we disagree about how to get there.
And finding that common ground means listening to each other, trying to understand where the other person is coming from.
It's about seeing each other as human beings.
Right.
Even when we disagree.
And I think that's a really important takeaway from this whole conversation.
It is, whether you agree with the idea of sanctuary cities or not, whether you support the Trump administration's approach or not.
It's crucial to come at this issue with empathy,
An
open mind, and willingness to have respectful conversations.
We're all in this together, right?
We are. We all have a part to play in building the kind of society we want.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of sanctuary cities.
Yeah, sounds good.
We've looked at the legal battles, the political maneuvering, the human cost, the moral dilemmas.
It's been a lot.
It has. But as with any deep dive, we've only scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn.
Always more to explore.
More to think about.
So we encourage you to keep learning about this issue.
Yeah.
Find different perspectives, challenge your own assumptions, and never stop asking questions.
Those are great words to live by.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive.
Okay.
We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
Me too.
And maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep diving deep.